Hello. For our ninth class, we have Cyprian of Carthage and the discussions of the unity and nature of the church and also of the approach of the church to its identity as a school for sinners rather than a collection of saints. In order to do this as well as we can, I think I need to begin with some background. As a matter of fact, the project that I've been working on for a number of years now relates exactly to this class. I'm working on Novation and the Novationists and their survival as a group in the early life of the church. So of course I've had to look at the Decian persecution as well as one can, and its aftermath in the church, and to try to figure out, not only discover what material there is that survives for us to look at, in other words, what we know, but also, or the things we know, but also to try to figure out what that information actually tells us, which is a different and oftentimes more difficult problem. To begin, the Emperor Decius begins the first empire-wide persecution of Christians. And that itself may be a mistake. I will send to you a bibliography on Cyprian of Carthage, and I'll also send to you a little bibliography on the Decian persecution. The Decian persecution is harder to study than one might think. We do not have the law surviving for any of these early persecutions, so we do not know exactly what it is that the law is demanding. Work has been done recently that I find quite convincing to say that, as a matter of fact, the Decian persecution was not intended by Decius and the government as a persecution of Christians, but that that is how it would have seemed from a Christian point of view. What seems to have happened is that the Roman Empire, after almost 100 years of doing really very well, had come into a very difficult period, starting at about the 240s AD, 230s AD. There began to be important rebellions in different parts of the empire, and the powers around the empire began pressing on it more severely and more continually, and things looked worse and worse. This actually continued up until the time of Diocletian, the main emperor before Constantine, who so for about, say, 70 years, 230 to 305, something like that, the Roman Empire had a really very difficult time. The last 20 years of that was better because Diocletian began pulling things together. Better if you weren't a Christian, right? But anyway, Diocletian began pulling things together, and the empire began to look as if it might, be able to bounce back. Decius' intention with this law seems to have been to seek the favor of the gods. As we have said before, there was no official Roman religion. There was a cult of Rome, the genius, the tutelary spirit, as they say. The guardian spirit of Rome was something that could be worshipped, and there were temples to the guardian spirit of Rome all around the empire, and that was the closest thing there was to a sort of official religion. But it's a mistake to call it an official religion, because of course doing that in no way interfered with any other kind of pagan worship that you were doing. It didn't. We think of religions as mutually exclusive. The pagan cults are not mutually exclusive. You can do all of them or some of them, or we've already talked about this. So Decius' idea seems to have been that he would require all the citizens of the empire, Roman citizenship at this point having been made universal under Caracalla in 212 AD. So in other words, all of the men who were free were citizens in the Roman Empire, and they would all have to go to their nearest cult center of the genius of the Roman Empire and offer a sacrifice on behalf of the empire, and this would please the gods, and so Rome would do better. This was very bureaucratically done, as we'll see when we look at the selections. When you went to do this sacrifice, you went to the temple and you identified yourself. In a lot of the smaller places, they would know you. Excuse me, because the towns were not that big and everybody knew everyone else. Of course, if you were in Rome, you had to tell people who you were because there were 1 million people in Rome. But anyway, you would identify yourself and perform your sacrifice, and then you would be given a certificate saying that you had performed your sacrifice. So if any official came up and said, have you sacrificed? You could say, sure, and whip out your certificate, and there it is. You'd be fine. Some of these certificates survive. That's how we know actually what they looked like. The intention, in other words, seems to be positive rather than negative. Decius is trying to do something that is going to help the Roman Empire with the gods. So it's an act of religious piety on behalf of this pagan. Jewish sacrifices would be done by the priests in the temple. Well, actually, there was no temple at that point, right? Jewish worship would be done by saying prayers for the emperor in the context of their synagogue worship, in the same way that Christians, according to the same model, now pray for the civil authorities, for those in civil authority, that sort of thing. Jews were not required to do sacrifices to the gods because under Roman law they were a special category, right? Christians, of course, were not a special category at this point, and as we have seen, they were legally considered to be a different group from Jews. An interesting question is what would have happened to Jewish Christians, and I am aware of no specific example that we can cite, but what logically would have happened is that if they were Jews in the sense of being recognized as Jews by their local Jewish community, that they would then have been able to go to the synagogue and participate in the prayers for the emperor, and then they would have been fine. In the same way that I understand Father Mountner, who is a priest in the APCK, who is from a Jewish background, there being nothing wrong with, there being, from a Christian point of view, there being no difficulty with being a Jew who is a Christian. I believe that Father Mountner still does at times participate in Jewish worship when he goes to his family home in Napa, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that from our point of view. My understanding is that his hometown synagogue, where he was born and raised, is so small and everyone knows each other, so that they are glad to see him back, and he is welcome there, as a boy produced by the synagogue. He is welcome there. So if this were the Roman Empire, then all of us would be in trouble, but he'd be okay because he'd be able to get a certificate, right? Now, many, because bureaucracy even now is not perfect, and then was a lot less perfect because they didn't have the kind of facilities we have. It was perfectly possible in a lot of places for Christians to do, for everybody, because, not everybody gets driver's licenses, even though they're supposed to. A lot of people, I don't know how you can do it, but a lot of people buy cars without driver's licenses and drive around without driver's licenses for their whole lives, apparently, and never seem to get in trouble. No matter what law you make, a lot of people just don't bother doing it. So it seems very likely that large numbers of people in the empire never did anything about this law and never got into trouble. It seems likely that among these were groups of Christians who did nothing about it and never got in trouble. One of the things you have to realize is that there very likely were places, maybe only small places, but places in the Roman Empire who never heard of this law and didn't know that there was something they were supposed to do. And So, missed the persecution completely. Let me tell you a quick story, which I think is important. Um, it's important to know because we have to understand the variety of possibilities when we're looking back on something like this. The later church, as we will see, this is an epoch-making period in the life of the church when many things about what is going to be required of Christians as far as public confession are worked out. But it's a mistake if you imagine some kind of science fiction thing like on Star Trek when everybody in the planet wears the same clothes and everything's got instant communications and everybody knows what's going on. The world just isn't like that. One of the great books to read about the Second World War was written by a German soldier named Hans von Luck, L-U-C-K, Luck, von Luck, who was a professional soldier, trained, had finished his training briefly right before the beginning of the war. So he was in his early 20s in 1939. All German officers at that point were either taught French or Russian, and they were trained to either fight on the Western Front or the Eastern Front. He was an Eastern Front guy, so he was taught Russian. He was the first German soldier into Poland at the beginning of the Second World War. It's a tremendous book. Everyone should read it. It's called Panzerleader, I believe, in English. And he's the first German soldier into Poland at the beginning of the war. At the end of the war, he's captured by the Russians and isn't released from captivity by them until 1955. So the war for him is 16 years long. And he lived into the 1990s, I think, or even perhaps later. It was a remarkable thing. But anyway, he tells a story. In the first big push east, and so that's 1941, right, Barbarossa, and they're pushing east and trying to conquer the Russians in the first swipe, though of course Hitler waits too long and everything, and the winter comes, the Russia's greatest soldier. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. They're within 100 miles, certainly, of Moscow, and he's still in a lead group, but at this point he's in a tank. And they are going into some forest. They're through the steppe and they're going into the forest, which is relatively close to Moscow. And they drive into the middle of a traditional Russian village, wooden, like the things you can see on the internet now, wooden buildings, all made out of huge logs, and in the middle of the village is a big church, right, in perfect condition. Out of the church comes a priest with a long beard and his robes and an icon around his neck, and everybody gathers around, and they're all saying to him, this must be the new Russian army, because they have the Wehrmacht has this cross on the side, so they assume that that's that they're Christian soldiers, and this is they must of course be Russian soldiers, because they're in the middle of Russia. After all, they're more than 1,000 miles from the border, and all these people come out and they all want to talk to the soldiers and everything. It becomes clear to von Luck that not only do these people not know about the Second World War, which at this point is 2.5 years old, but they haven't heard about the Russian Revolution. They think that all these people are good Tsarist soldiers, and the Tsar has sent them out to check on them, and they're so glad to see them. Here's their parish priest, and they're doing all the stuff, and they haven't heard about anything. And von Luck, who, at that point, there's a lot of bad stuff to come, but at that point he's seen enough bad stuff, so he doesn't want to start, shooting up the place, these poor people. So he tells them, don't worry about it, go back to your daily lives, citizens. And he backs his unit out of the woods the same way. They go back and they cover their tracks. They wipe them with branches like in a Western movie to try to cover their tracks. And he says, boys, we're going around. And they go around the woods and they go on. He doesn't come back the same way later. But that story is important to know, because we imagine, of course, the Second World War as being all-encompassing and overwhelming and being the most important thing that happened, certainly in Europe, in the 1930s and 1940s. And the idea of people living, what we would think of as an hour's drive from Moscow, and not only not having heard about the Second World War in the middle of it, but also not having heard about the Russian Revolution, which at that point is 34 years, no, 24 years old. And they haven't heard about the Russian Revolution. They come out and they say, how's the Tsar? We pray for him every day. It's very important not to get the idea that Decius, says everybody's going to sacrifice and everybody has to sacrifice. And so everyone is struck with this incredible moral dilemma. There's no question that in larger places that were better connected, like Carthage, where Cyprian is, in larger places that are better connected, that the laws arrive very quickly and are pronounced and even plastered up on, posters in the forum, and people know what the law is, and then the local governors would do their best to put it into practice. So that it's someone like Cyprian, who is living in Carthage, which is the most important city by far in Roman Africa, is going to be confronted with a situation where he's going to have to do something. And we'll talk about Cyprian in a minute. For less important people, less socially prominent and less ecclesiastically prominent, they might be ratted out by friends and neighbors. They might be known by someone in authority to be a Christian, and people just haven't done anything about it because, who cares? I can't right now think of anyone I know who doesn't have a driver's license, but if I knew someone who was driving around without a driver's license, I guess we probably have a sheriff in Maryland. I don't even know if we have a sheriff. I wouldn't call the police or my instinct is not to turn everybody in for everything they do. So there may very well have been unimportant Christians who, or Christian laity of the more humble sort, who might have been turned in by other people unwillingly. There also may well have been a lot of them who just didn't do anything and were never noticed. We know of a wide variety of things happening. We know of Christians who immediately upon hearing the law went to the forum and performed the sacrifice and got their certificate. We know of Christians who immediately upon hearing the law hired, got friends who were pagan to go and say, I'm Bob Jones, because who's going to know? It's not like everybody has picture ID, right? They're saying, I'm Bob Jones, and get a certificate that says Bob Jones sacrificed, and then take it home and give it to Bob. And so Bob had a certificate even though he was a Christian and never did it. We know that there were those people. We know that there were Christians who didn't do anything and hoped that they wouldn't be noticed. And we know that there were Christians in some places who went into the forum and said, I'm a Christian, I'm not going to do this, you're all terrible pagans, and got themselves arrested. We know all of those varieties. And of course some Christians ran away. All of those things were possible. All of those things happened. The way the persecution seems to have worked is that there was an initial sort of push, and then it died away. Decius after all, didn't live very long. But then after he was gone, there was a kind of reawakening of the persecution about 5 years later. It's in the reawakening of the persecution, actually, that Cyprian himself is martyred in 258. So there's sort of two waves of persecution. There is a timetable in the back of our the new Eusebius, which has some of this mapped out, where you can see the the Emperor Decius only lasts 2 years, 249 to 251, and then there people get in trouble, and then Valerian and Gallienus come along after him, and they push again, and that's the time when Cyprian gets martyred. It's also the time when Lawrence, the famous roasted on the grill St. Lawrence in Rome, gets killed. Anyway, so that's what's going on. There's going to be, it's going to be tremendously messy. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Nobody ever really seems to have expected, either pagan or Christian, that this was going to happen. It's not like people were, waiting, here it comes, because this was a first time thing. Now we're used to the idea of organized persecution of Christians, like what Stalin did, killing tens of thousands of Russian Orthodox priests, nailing them to the doors of their churches in a mockery of the crucifixion. That kind of thing had never happened anywhere in the world before. And so this is a very difficult period to figure out. It's a long time ago. Information is difficult to come by and very scattered. We really know any kind of detail at all only about a very few places. We don't know very much about Rome. We know more about Carthage because Cyprian leaves a very large collection of letters. We know a little bit about Alexandria. Eusebius in his church history tells us some things, but we really don't know very much, and there are large parts of the empire where we don't really know very much at all. One of the things I'm trying to do is to try to figure out every place that I can discover where there was a record of there being Novatianists. Novatianists being rigorists who, after this all has happened, or actually in the middle of it, really between the two pushes, right? So in the early 250s, churches have to decide what they're going to do with people who have lapsed, which means fallen, because Christians who had sacrificed came back to the church and said, I sacrificed, it was the wrong thing to do, I'm sorry, I repent, I want to do penance and be accepted back into the church. And the church had to decide what they were going to do. As we've said before, I think, previous to this, the general Christian practice, as far as we can tell, had been public apostasy, which is what this is, meant that you were out of the church for life. You could be, any sinner of any stripe could be, the mass murderer could repent on his deathbed and be received back into the church on his deathbed and get last communion and then die as a Christian. But before then, most places, as far as we know, thought it was standard practice that a major sin like public apostasy was not forgivable by the church. The church did not have the authority to forgive that sin. The question is, what's the church going to do when you don't have one guy in Gaul, but you've got 10,000 people, or we don't know how big the church is now. 10,000 is probably good because a general bet on the size of the church for now is 200 or 250,000 people. So 10,000 people is a big chunk, it's 4%. Suppose you've got 10,000 people around the world who come to the church and want to be accepted. What do you do? Another problem. In many parts of the empire, if you were rounded up as being a Christian and then taken to do the sacrifice and they said, will you sacrifice? And you said no, they put you in jail. In some places, and practice varied a lot from place to place. Some places, if you didn't do it, they executed you. Some places, if you didn't do it, they put you in jail. Some places, if they put you in jail, after a while, they would give you another try, and then if you didn't do it, they would execute you. Some places, they would take you back again in front of the magistrate and say, have you changed your mind? And then if you said, no, I haven't changed your mind, they'd send you back to jail. Some people were disadvantaged by imprisonment, and then they would confiscate all of your belongings and stuff. Of course, for most ancient people, that didn't mean much. It was everything they had, but they didn't have anything. But if you did ever come out, you would be destitute. But some people were disadvantaged by imprisonment. They had confessed that they were Christians, and they came to be called, over a process of time, confessors, people who had publicly confessed that they were Christians and been disadvantaged. Some people who confessed were eventually executed, and they came to be called martyrs, witnesses, right? As a matter of fact, there are martyr acts from the ancient church where the people are not actually killed because they did confess publicly, they bore witness to their faith publicly, and they were thrown in jail for a while, and then after a while they said, oh, I'll send them home, who cares? So we have martyr acts where the people are not killed, which is actually interesting to see. I think it is a useful thing to read some of those with people. There are in the Ante-Nicene Christian Library the martyr acts of Shimona, Guria, and Habib, 3 martyrs from Edessa who are put in jail and then are get off. I used to give those martyr acts to my students, partly because their names are weird and obviously Middle Eastern, like Habib, good old Saint Habib, right? Who nobody's ever heard of, but clearly is a saint. And also because it makes clear to the students that being a martyr means being a witness to your faith, that you can be a martyr without being killed. We now have this sort of technical distinction between confessor and martyr, and which is a useful distinction for us because we want to be able to talk about, like in this class, confessors who were in prison. Interestingly enough, Christian people would go visit them in prison and not be arrested, which it all seems very strange to us. But someone would be in prison for being a Christian, and other people from the church would go visit him and take him. The Roman prisons didn't provide you with food and stuff, so people would come and bring you food and talk to you and pray with you and sing hymns with you and stuff, and then go home. It all sounds very strange for people who were used to, the Nazis and the communists being very efficient about their persecution. But this definitely happened, and some of the people who wanted to be received back by the church would go to call on these confessors in their jail cells, who were obviously blessed with the Holy Ghost because they had the charism, the great blessing of being public confessors of their faith. And they would ask for them to forgive their sins, and the confessors would forgive their sins and write them a little note or dictate a little note saying, good old Bob has come to me and said that he's repentant, and so I've forgiven his sins and sent him back to you, Bishop, for him to be reunited to the Christian family. And then the bishop's got a real problem. What's the bishop going to do? In a lot of places we know the bishop said, okay, the confessor's got charismatic power, and so if he forgives your sins, that's good enough for me. In some places the bishop said, wait a sec. Just because you're in jail doesn't mean you don't get to forgive sins. We think you're wonderful. We pray for you every Sunday. But, forgiving sins is not the job for people in jail. Forgiving sins is a job for people in charge. And some people said, nobody can forgive sins. What kind of a kook are you? And they began forming the dissident group that later would be known as the Novatianists. This same dilemma and this same split in the church seems clearly to have happened not in the name Novatianist for this group, and since we know that Novatians in Rome, might make you think that this group begins in Rome and then spreads. We know that that is absolutely incorrect. This group begins everywhere this problem arises, which is to say pretty much everywhere. It arises everywhere because the situation that produces it is everywhere. This shows a real difficulty in the church's life. What does membership in the church mean? What does it require, expect of a person? What privileges does it grant? What is required to maintain membership in the church? What is required to begin membership in the church? Can anybody baptize anybody else? Do certain particular rites have to be performed, or do the rites have to have particular words in them in order for them to work? All of these questions, which had not been settled before, came to the fore. And so this becomes not only a tragic period in the life of the church because of the torture and execution of a relatively large number of people. We don't know exactly how many, of course, but it's also a tremendously fruitful and important period in terms of the development of the disciplinary system of the church. Discipline is a Latin word that means teaching or instruction. It doesn't mean punishment. Punishment's also a Latin word, right? A penal system and a disciplinary system are different things. The church has a disciplinary system. It does not now and never has had a penal system. Okay? So don't think of time spent in penance as punishment. It's not. It's instruction. Anyway, the development of the disciplinary system and the development of theology. So let's say a little bit about Cyprian to begin with. Cyprian, a lot of work has been done about Cyprian. He's a tremendously important author. I'm sending you a bibliography of his works and works about him. There's been a lot of really good work in recent times about him. Patu Burns and Robin Jensen, who are actually married to each other, have produced a very important and useful book just in the last year on the church in Rome and North Africa, called Christianity in North Africa, the Development of Its Practices and Beliefs. That is by far the best place to read about African Christianity. Of course, it's also a tremendously important book for the study of St. Augustine. And of course Tertullian too. You know, it's Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine are the three biggest ancient African Christians, and that book is a primary source for the study of all of them. So Cyprian is clearly an upper class man. Whether he's of senatorial rank or not is something that people fight about, so therefore that means that we don't know. He's clearly a gentleman. He's clearly educated. He's clearly well-to-do, at least. He has estates outside of Carthage. He seems to have functioned as a lawyer, which is not as much a profession in the ancient world as it is a kind of class-related thing to do. Virtually all upper-class Roman men were taught to be lawyers. It was like studying Latin and Greek in 1850 in England. It was what every upper-class male did. So he's certainly trained in rhetoric and law, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a professional lawyer. He may have just been a professional landowner, a farmer. He is a Christian for only 12 years. He is a Christian for... Certainly when he joins the church in Carthage, he is immediately the most important person in the church because he's one of the most important people in the city. So when he joins the church, he's immediately the most important guy there. So it's not surprising that before the persecution really kicks in, he is elected bishop after being a Christian for only 2 years because he is such an important person in a deferential society, and also in a society which is ruled top down. Having a top guy being in charge of you is the obvious thing to do if you can possibly arrange it, because if the church ever needs someone to speak for them, they have someone who can get in the door. Cyprian is the kind of person who, if there's a problem that the church has, can call socially on the governor of Africa and say, "Hey, Bob, let's sit down and talk about this." And the governor will take the Christians more seriously because Cyprian, who is obviously an important and, respectable person, is a member of the group. They're not just Hell's Angels, but also because they have an important, respectable person speaking for them. So this is why one of the things you should know. I should put this on the list. There is a life of Cyprian that survives, written by a deacon, one of his deacons in the church who actually knew him, and it includes, among other things, an eyewitness account of his martyrdom, which is a remarkable thing to read. I will note that down on your bibliography, because it's something everybody should really know. It's very cool. There aren't a whole lot of those things from this early. This is really very early. Anyway, we know that Cyprian spent a lot of time studying Tertullian because he was trying to learn Christian theology, because, here he was, a happy new baptizand, and all of a sudden, oops, I'm bishop. So he did a lot of work. Luckily, he was academically trained, so he knew how to study stuff. And he had Tertullian to study. Cyprian is not what we would call a creative theologian. He's not trying to be a creative theologian. He's got to be relatively creative because he's got new problems to solve. But it's not like he's sitting in his room. He's not Tertullian, who is sitting in his room wondering about the threeness of God, inventing the term Trinity, right? That's not what Cyprian's doing. Cyprian's, I would say, well, his most important theological works are certainly the two treatises on the Church, on the Lapsed and on the Unity of the Catholic Church. But I would argue that his best theological work might be his little treatise on the Lord's Prayer, which is a very nice little treatise on the Lord's Prayer. It's as good as any the Church has yet produced. It's a very, you can give it to a group of laity and they will come back the better for it. They will not, you don't have to worry about them wandering off into the places they shouldn't go, which laity like to do. So you have to be a little careful with what you give them. So it is, just to finish before we start looking at original sources, another thing that's important to know is in the first push of persecution, Cyprian, being the most prominent Christian in Carthage, leaves town and goes to his country estate. He says to protect the church, partly because he doesn't want to be executed himself, because if he's executed, he can't guide the church and he can't use his social position to protect the church, but also because having someone like Cyprian as a member of the church makes the church much more prominent, and so actually puts the church into danger. So this is, at least is his argument, that he leaves town not because he is abandoning the church, but because he is trying to protect the church. After he comes back, and he is in contact with the church during the active part of the persecution. Then when things die down, he comes back to town, and when the persecution heats up again, there's been some criticism of Cyprian. In the meantime, he's written his two treatises on the Lapsed and on the Unity of the Catholic Church, and a great number of the letters that survive are written in that intermediate period. And then when the persecution heats up again, he does not try to avoid it, and so ends up being arrested and tried, and the martyr acts are on your list, and then executed. He has his head cut off because he's upper class, so they don't crucify him, which is for a non-citizen, and they don't throw him to the lions because he's a respectable guy. They cut his head off, which is much more high-end in terms of martyrdom. That is described by the deacon, I think his name is Pontianus, and you can read about it. Okay, so let's begin looking through some of these things, and you can see we have quite a few selections that I set aside for you this time for different reasons. I left out a lot of stuff. Cyprian's very important treatises on the church, on the Lapsed and on the Unity of the Catholic Church, are actually quite brief. They're not tremendously long. They've been published multiple times in modern English translations, all of which are good, all of which have good notes. They're very easy to get a hold of and very useful to read, and I commend them to you all. We have some, here is a description, 192 on page 239 is a description of the Decian persecution in Alexandria in Egypt, which survives in Eusebius's church history. He's quoting from a letter that the Bishop of Alexandria writes to Antioch. And I included these things so you could get some of a sense of the confusion of the period. 193, starting on page 240, has some of these libelli of the persecution of Decius. More have been discovered. The classic publication of these was in the Harvard Theological Review in 1923. More have been discovered since then and have been published, but they are not absolutely standardized. This is before standardized forms, but it's quite clear that, by reading some of these you can see the way they work. It's really very interesting. We could spend a happy hour just looking at the libelli, but we won't do that now. Cyprian, in his On the Lapsed in 194, which I didn't even put on your list, has another description of how he's trying to explain how come Christians, he's writing a treatise on the fallen Christians, and his first question is, if Christians are supposed to be the people of God, how come they're falling? What's the problem? And so he's trying to describe that in 194 and 195. Both of these together give you a sense of the confusion and the fright. One of the things that seems clear from the general tone of this, all of these descriptions and the letters and things that survive, is that the church was not huge at this point. As I said, a prominent modern guess, because it really is a guess, is that there were about 250,000 Christians in the Roman Empire at this point. The empire, some people would have said at this point, has about 60 million people, so that's 1 in every 240. Some people would say it had 100 million people, so that would be 1 in every 400 people is a Christian. In other words, the Christians are small. That's like the number of Sikhs in the United States. It's just, I know from movies what Sikhs look like, but I can't recall ever seeing one in the United States. I know that they're out there. But you can live a lot of places in the U.S. and not see any Sikhs, and you could live a lot of places in the Roman Empire and never see any Christians, and probably a lot of people in the Roman Empire never heard of the Christians. I think the scholarship that argues that the Decian persecution is a persecution from the point of view of the church, but not a persecution from the point of view of the government, is an important point. When we get to Diocletian, that really is a persecution. He's going after the church. I don't think Decius is going after the church. I think he's trying to get the gods to like the Roman Empire more, which doesn't make it any better for the people who are being eaten by the lions or having their heads cut off, but it's worth knowing. Okay, this letter of the Confessors, which is quoted by Cyprian in one of his letters, this is one of the notes that they would write in prison and send out. Know that, number 196 on 244, know that we have granted peace to all of whose behavior since the commission of their crime you are satisfied. It's a note to the bishop. In other words, we desire through you to make this known to other bishops also. We wish you to maintain peace with the holy martyrs. Lucian wrote this, there being present of the clergy an exorcist and a reader, so he had clergy witnesses to the fact that Lucian the confessor is writing this. I do note, and I think sometimes even by Cyprian, it's not given as much weight as possible, is that he says, we've granted peace. In other words, we've allowed back into the church all of those fallen whose behavior since they fell satisfies the bishop. The bishop still can say your behavior doesn't satisfy me, right? They're not grabbing everything away from the bishop as far as discipline goes. They're still leaving it to a certain degree in the hands of the bishop. Cyprian was not convinced by that point of view because he felt that the confessors were pushing in where they didn't belong and that this should be done by the hierarchy, but it is worth noting it. Okay. Um, 197 in another letter of Cyprian also explains, how it worked, um, how this process of getting a certificate from the confessors in prison worked. Um, Here we have a description in 202 by Cyprian in a letter of the decisions of the councils of Carthage. One of the interesting things about this is that from Cyprian's letters and the life, we know that there were quite frequent and relatively large synods held in Carthage. That synods are a very ancient Christian thing and were relatively standard behavior. Bishops expected for there to be synods when things got, when there were questions to be decided. And that's worth knowing. This is right about the time that we begin to be able to see what synods do. In the 230s, 240s, and 250s is when you begin to see synods. And there may have been earlier, there were meetings like the Council of Jerusalem. But, anything the apostles do is kind of hard to say that's the way the church always did it, because, the apostles are sort of a wild card automatically. But anyway, let's keep going. This is a very useful chronology of Cyprian on page 251. This is in this edition of the New Eusebius, this is a new edition, and it's a real help. Okay, 207. Now we get to thinking about, this is about Rome. This is the passage so famous in a letter of Cornelius, the Bishop of Rome, talking about the what's going on in the Church of Rome and giving those statistics that I've mentioned a number of times so far. 46 presbyters, 7 deacons, 7 subdeacons, 42 acolytes, 52 exorcists, readers, and doorkeepers, etc. Modern scholars go all the way from arguing 46 presbyters means 46 congregations in Rome, so now we know how many parish churches there were, which is pretty... That's giving a lot of credit to your ability to take a number and stick it into a situation and know exactly what it means, when, as I said, we don't have any numbers from any other places and no parish names from any, I think that's not scholarship, that's silliness. But it is very interesting to have this, tremendously interesting. The most useful thing about it, I think, is that they have 1,500 widows and persons in distress. If the church in Rome, or the collection of congregations in Rome, is really large enough to support 1,500 indigent people, then by figuring out, and there are people who know this kind of detail, and I gave on the book list that I sent last week about the very early church in Rome, that book by Dyson, D-Y-S-O-N, which is a brilliant work, would be very useful to try to figure out how much money you'd have to support 1,500 people, keep them alive. And but that gives you some idea of the size of the church. It's got to be relatively big. If every family, to take an example, because we had some indigent people in our little congregation that we were trying to support, if every family takes an extra, takes one person, and you're supporting an extra person, how much does that really require? Well, of course, if they're not going to live with you, then the primary expense is going to be housing them. The same thing was true in Rome, and people rented apartments in Rome just like they rent apartments in modern American cities. And very soon the expense gets pretty large. So 1,500 people is a lot of people to try to support. And if they really did that, then that's a remarkable thing. There are a number of... the story about St. Nicholas of Myra, who through a lot of work and later stuff turns into Santa Claus. There are Myras on the coast of Asia Minor. There are a couple of stories about St. Nicholas of Myra. The first is that, who seems to have been well-to-do, he was in the 300s, before the legalization of Christianity, at least partly. And one of the stories about him is that some children, Christian children, were captured by pirates, and he sent sacks of money to ransom them, which is where the sacks, like Santa Claus's bag, originally comes from, and also his connection with children. But another story is that the church in Myra, largely supported by Nicholas's own deep pockets, supported quite a lot of poor people, and that in the persecution under Diocletian, that the government officials went to the church in Myra and said, come tomorrow morning or some particular day, we want you to gather together all the treasures owned by your church, because we're going to confiscate them. And so they gathered together, the bishop gathered together all the poor who were supported by the church. And so when the soldiers came to collect all the goodies, Bishop Nicholas said, these are the treasures of our church. This is where we put our treasure on earth, supporting all these people. And that the story is that the local governor, aware that if he wrecked the church, he would then have all these people to take care of, decided to back off and leave the church alone. He may also have realized that change was coming, because very soon after that, Christianity was legalized in the East because Constantine conquered the eastern part of the empire. And so he may have been a little bit more like Pontius Pilate than he was like any other Roman official, seeing which way the wind was blowing. But anyway, the point of the story, of course, from our point of view, is that the church was supporting a lot of indigent people. So if that's true in Myra in Asia Minor, and if that's true in Rome in Italy, then those are two very different parts of the world where it's true both in the period before the legalization of Christianity. So we wish we knew more about that kind of thing, but we don't. Okay, we have a few more of these passages to look at in our remaining 7 minutes. Cyprian here in letter 69, schismatical baptism invalid. The people outside the church, says Cyprian, cannot have valid baptism because they cannot, when they ask the questions at the baptism, do you believe in the remission of sins and eternal life by the Holy Church, they cannot ask that question because they're not members of the Holy Church, so they can't ask about the Holy Church. One of the things that's quite clear if you read Cyprian is that Cyprian's idea of the church at base is of the church as an organized, visible body to which people can be seen to belong. In other words, the later idea of the body of Christ on earth as essentially a spiritual reality that can be instantiated in groups that meet together and things like that is not yet there. That's going to come from St. Augustine largely later. So for Cyprian, when he's talking about the oneness of the Catholic Church, as Hall says, which is very important, unity, unitas, is a Latin word like trinitas. Trinitas means the threeness, and unitas means the oneness. De unitate, de ecclesiae catholicae, on the unity, the oneness of the Catholic Church. He thinks that the Catholic Church is one body that people can belong to, and if you can't see that people belong to it, then they don't. And if they don't belong to it, then they completely don't belong to it. So it doesn't matter what you're doing off stage in your group. It doesn't matter how you dress, and it doesn't matter what you do and say, even if you do and say in your little group exactly what they do in the Catholic Church. It has nothing to do with the Catholic Church at all, because you do not belong So therefore, nothing you do is actually Christian. You can parody the church, but you cannot sort of spiritually belong to the church. That idea is not present in Cyprian, and that's one of the great distinctions between his idea and the idea that becomes to be regnant later, certainly in Western Christian thinking, Latin Christian thinking, but also in Greek Christian thinking, though of course, that development happens differently because they're not influenced by Augustine the way we are. We have two more, 217 and 218. 217 is Firmilian, the bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, which is the place that Basil the Great is going to be the bishop of later, writing to Cyprian about the rebaptism of heretics. This is quite a long passage. It's 4 pages or so in this book. The discussion is worth looking at. There's an extended discussion about all this kind of stuff. And the thing to take away from this, I mean, if we had time, we would sit down with these treatises and talk about the nature of the church, and we'd learn a lot. But the thing you need to know in order to be able to read these writings with intelligence is that it seems clear that there's tremendous confusion in all these different places in the church, and that people are doing their best to respond to it in the way that seems best to them. There certainly are bishops who completely chicken out and apostatize themselves, and there even is a case, as Hall mentions, of a bishop who takes his whole congregation to sacrifice together to protect them. That certainly happened because we have records of it. There certainly also are, bishops like Cyprian who were martyred and were heroes. Cyprian himself is interesting because, as I said the first time around, he leaves town for very reasonable and cogent, intentions, but gets criticized for it, and so the next time around doesn't leave town and gets killed for it. Cyprian, who dies a martyr, the first time this begins, he leaves town. I think it's not. It's too easy to say that first he's scared and later he's not. There's more than that going on. People don't know exactly what the best and most responsible way to respond to this threat is. There is some real logic in the Libolatici, the people with certificates, who went and just got some other pagan to go in and get a certificate with their name on it and never sacrificed. That makes perfect sense. The law requires you to get a certificate that says you've sacrificed. So if you're a Christian and your faith doesn't allow you to sacrifice, you get a certificate, but you don't sacrifice. Those people were condemned by the church. As things developed, they were condemned. They were, in some places, clearly at the beginning, people thought that was kind of a clever way out of the problem. As time goes on, the church becomes convinced that you cannot do that. You can not do anything, and if they don't come and arrest you, okay. No Christian is required to turn yourself in. But you can't get a certificate saying that you sacrificed if you didn't sacrifice, because that is a kind of second-hand apostasy. That's not the only way that clearly, logically, if you think about it, that's not the only way the church could have responded to that situation. They might have said, well, sounds good to us. Let's put some people with good handwriting to work and we'll make everybody certificates, right? In the same way that people smuggled Jews out of Nazi Germany, one of the first things they did was take off their yellow star, right? You don't sort of try to go through the passport checkpoint with your yellow star. Hi, I'm a Jew. I'm just sneaking out, They'd take their star off, which is sort of the equivalent of getting a certificate when you didn't really do it. I've never heard anyone saying, what a chicken. That's being a bad Jew. They should have just, walked up and said, hey, I'm a Jew, see you later, and gotten executed. Confusion uncertainty, a general desire to apply Christian teaching and moral expectations to a new situation that wasn't exactly clear and also may have been different from one place to another. This is why I haven't tried to go through these readings with you. It's tremendously messy. I spent months doing nothing but reading Cyprian stuff. I think it was last spring. And it's tremendously time consuming, and you can only sort it out to a certain degree, and then after that you have to give up. We can't make absolute sense of all of what's going on, even in the place we know the most about. The place we know the most about for the Decian persecution is Carthage. Cyprian is the individual we know the most about because of all of his letters and the eyewitnesses and things like that. And we still can't figure out exactly what's going on with him. He's only a Christian for 12 years, most of which he's the bishop. It's a tremendous mess, and the church responds in a way which is actually very far on the forgiving end of the spectrum. The church comes to the conclusion that there is no sin that's so grievous, because public apostasy would be the worst sin possible. There is no sin so grievous that it cannot be forgiven by the mercy of God exercised through the church. And that is a position of great mercy and hope. That's not what many people expected the church to do. It seems very clearly not to have been what the church had previously done. It's a change of mind. But it's what we have been living with ever since. It's very interesting that this disciplinary system, by which you confess your sins and then are absolved after doing penance, is now considered brutally cruel, when at the time that it was introduced for much more grievous sins, it was considered horrifyingly lax. That's something to think about right there. It says a lot about their culture, and it says a lot about ours. Thank you.